equal spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 10200. We're back for another midweek podcast. I'm joined by my co-host Kieran Kelly. How are you doing, Kieran?
Oh, well, you know, the news keeps feeling like a boot in the stomach every day, but pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's looking kind of bad out there at the moment, but we are not going to be talking as much about the present day. We're going to be talking about other horrible things of the past and of the present, but 50-50 split perhaps. And people have heard you on the podcast before. They'll know you're a genocide researcher, and that's the topic for this evening. We're kind of it's been a real trip watching the way that people in the media, and in certain political spheres have taken the word genocide and either intentionally tried to undermine the use of the term or done this kind of like moral tone policing, like, oh, we cannot use the term genocide for what's happening in Gaza because that undervalues it. And so I think it's really a good time to, I don't know like how much of a faux pas it is to call this a genocide primer, but that's kind of what we're going to do. Go over the history of the term, over some of the genocides of the past and how society has interacted with those, and kind of bring that into the present. Does that sound like something that you thought we were going to do after sending me this brief?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think maybe focusing on the underlying concept, because it's easy to, like as you say, tone police when you don't have any solid grounds for doing so. And of course, the most shrill and certain people are the people with the least knowledge frequently about this sort of thing. So, I think the actual knowledge of most people is they have been misled a lot about it, and I think they'll be surprised to hear where it came from and what it means.
Absolutely. Well, let's kick into it because it's not actually, in terms of the concept and the word itself, it's not actually that historic, right? Like it's in modern day history.
Yeah. So it was first used in 1943 or 44. First published in 1944, and it really I think it's worth talking about the man who created the term and getting into some of his life and his times and how it came about. So he was born in 1900 or 1901, I think 1900, yeah. And he was born in what is now Western Belarus. He was Polish ethnically and Jewish. And before he died, he did nearly complete a memoir called Totally Unofficial, which lays out some of his life story. So we do have that. And of course, I think also the title gives you an idea of who this man was. So he, when he was young, he became obsessed with mass atrocities. He was particularly taken by the historical novel Quo Vadis, which was written by a Polish author, which is set in the time of Nero and depicts the persecution of early Christians. He was also fascinated. Well, he was interested in the persecution of the Huguenots in France, and also closer to where he lived in time as well, the 1906 Białystok pogrom in today's Poland. And when he was 15, the Armenian genocide happened as well. So these things all affected him. And he trained as a lawyer. And in his 30s, he was working as a public prosecutor in Warsaw. And in 1933, he went to an international symposium of legal thinkers who were looking at international law. And he proposed to make new international crimes. So some crimes like piracy were already international, and so was prohibition of slavery.
That's like downloading cars and the like, right?
Very much so. They were very, very anti at that stage, and they wanted people to know that piracy is theft. You know, and I don't know if you're old enough to remember. Would you steal from blah blah blah? Yes. So that's what they were all about in those days, and he wanted to add some more seriousness to that. So he proposed several international crimes, and one of them was barbarity, which he described as attacks carried out against an individual as a member of a collectivity, with the goal of the author of the crime is not only to harm the individual, but also to cause damage to the collectivity to which they belong. And also, he wanted another crime called vandalism, which he described as the systematic and organized destruction of the art and cultural heritage of a collectivity. So he portrayed these as a loss to humanity as a whole on the grounds of the loss of unique diversity. Now, he was actually, if you read Totally Unofficial, you find out that he was somewhat of a race essentialist, right? So, I mean, whether it's in cultural terms or not, he loved diversity. So this is all very admirable, but he thought that each race had their particular genius. We are talking about a person of his time. He wasn't. Um, he wasn't transcendently smart or anything like that, but he was very humane in his inclinations. So when he was writing this stuff, he's presenting really what amounts to political theory, because he's trying to figure out the reasons why people are doing these horrendous crimes, rather than trying to work from a legal theory background. So it may be that was why they kind of went down like a lead balloon, or it didn't really go anywhere anyway. So in 1939, he fled the German and Soviet invasion of Poland, and it was seriously dangerous journey for him. He went back to where his parents were living in, I believe they're living in what is now Western Ukraine, and he tried to get them to leave with him, but they said they were too old, and he had to leave them behind, more or less not expecting that they would live through what was to come, because he could kind of see that. And eventually he arrived in Sweden, where he just went to work really hard and wrote a book called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And chapter 9 of that, which is only 15, 16 pages. It's not very long. It only takes a very short time to read, but this is where he introduced the concept of genocide. Again, going back to this idea that he's totally unofficial, he actually described the sort of sense of relief of leaving behind this prosecutor identity.
Yeah.
Being an arm of the state, being an enforcer for the state didn't really sit well with him. But I do have to say that, of course, I don't know if he completely escaped that prosecutor identity because of where he led the concept of genocide later as a crime. But he wrote, so this term genocide was more or less a synthesis of this vandalism idea and the barbarism idea, which it means that he's kind of seeing that these things are of a piece. They're not separate. The violence and the destruction of cultural heritage is actually one and the same thing. I think that if we want to understand genocide, I think this is the primary text to go from, because it was unmitigated by later concerns about making it a crime, or his only interest at the time wasn't to promote a political project that he later had. It was to describe what was happening. So within limits, I think it is the best way to understand it. Although he would later write he started a 3-volume history of genocide, which I haven't read, which was never published. But that probably also has a lot of material as well. Again, this is theory. It's not him trying to describe a crime. He is describing a behavior, and he backs it up with some pretty good empirical research. So he had, the Germans were not shy about promulgating some of their policies, and they're, obviously very precise in the way they denominate certain things. So he was able to produce calorie charts showing how much different ethnicities were allocated to be fed. Some of whom were basically put on starvation diets. So he defined genocide as a process made up of different actions with the same aim.
And we've got into
So,
this before, haven't we? So
yeah.
and this is one of those things that causes confusion. And one of the ways that people who are denying genocide or who are engaging in genocide apologia try and pull apart, because they'll say, oh no, if it was like, this is one of the really horrific ones that comes out of the Israeli narrative, right? Oh, if it was a genocide, we would have killed them all already.
Yeah.
And like they know exactly what they're doing. And anyone who's studied genocide or has listened to one of our podcasts about it, or any other number of things, listen to any other experts about it, knows that it doesn't have to be all of a sudden.
No. I mean, it as a process, it isn't necessarily going to reach a specific endpoint as well. It is an ongoing thing. So he just, when at one point he describes the aim as if the aim is extermination. He calls it the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group and the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. Although he also says the imposition may be made on the oppressed population, which can remain on the territory, or it may be made on the territory after they have been removed, either ethnically cleansed or exterminated.
And this is another one of the ways in which it's another piece of genocide apologia, right? Which is something that you often see about Palestine. They say, oh, but look at the birth rate, as if that means a genocide isn't ongoing there.
Yes, absolutely. And there is nothing in well, as we'll see, there's nothing in Lemkin's writing or the convention or the legal convention that makes a distinction like that. But ironically, Lemkin would use that himself later when he didn't like someone's claim of genocide. But we'll get to that. So, and then like he uses very broad examples. It is a process. It's very complex. A guy called John Docker, who did read his work on the history of genocide, he described his thinking as that genocide was complex and manifold. So it's never just one thing. It's, so he also uses he also writes the following: the enemy nation in the control of Germany must be destroyed, disintegrated, or weakened in different degrees for decades to come. Thus, the German people in the post-war period will be in a position to deal with other European peoples from a vantage point of biological superiority. So it is not necessarily about complete destruction. So when he describes genocide, he talks, for example, about the treatment of Greece, and there's no suggestion that the Germans wanted to exterminate all Greeks. He, very notably, he mentions Luxembourgers several times, and one of the things he notes, he's using this as an exemplar of genocide, mind you. He writes, nationals of Luxembourg having foreign or non-German first names were required to assume in lieu thereof the corresponding German first names, or if that is impossible, they must select German first names. So having to change your name to Fritz or something like that is basically a form of genocide in these terms. Now, obviously, it's not going to be a standalone thing, but that's the point. It's complex and manifold. So because it's a process, rather than having fated end to define it. It should be seen as having a telos, a direction of travel. So otherwise, how can you? I mean, how could you, if you were to try and define genocide as an attempted extermination, how could you ever say in the middle of it, this is an attempted extermination? It's really going to be far too late by the time you come to that sort of level. And we had, there was a genocide expert on Al Jazeera that I may have complained about previously. I think I did, who said that we couldn't call it a genocide because there hadn't been a court case.
No, like we've had people do that, like in New Zealand, right? There are people in New Zealand media who have made this argument as well, but it's all part. I mean, the apologia is as complex and manifold as the genocide itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And this was a genocide scholar, and we shouldn't. I mean, there are a number of good genocide scholars out there, but a lot of people who maybe in the university system who have an interest or have a think of themselves as having some expertise. It can be a bit obtuse on the subject. Anyway, so he divided genocidal actions into political, which means taking over the running of the territory and the people, obviously, is a pretty easy one. Social, where he wrote, the focal point of this attack has been the intelligentsia. The tendency of the occupant is to retain in Poland only the laboring and peasant class. So we look at the scholasticide in Gaza, for example. This is eliticide is a very common, prominent part of genocide. So a lot of the signs you hear about that they can be seen as aspects of genocide. They could stand alone, but some things like politicide is something else. But scholasticide, sociocide, culturecide, eliticide, and so forth, they're all potentially components of genocide. Okay, so and then the next one was cultural. Not only have national creative activities in the cultural and artistic field been rendered impossible by regimentation, but the population has also been deprived inspiration from the existing cultural and artistic values. Thus, especially in Poland, were national monuments destroyed and libraries, archives, museums, and galleries of art carried away. Now, of course, this will resonate with people who've been watching what's happened in Palestine, but one should also think of Iraq, for example, where there was this massive explosion of violence against and looting of destruction of very old archaeological sites and so forth. If you go back through the history of the settlement of Palestine by Israel, of course, also that there's quite a lot of that sort of thing has been done with considerable systematic intent. Right. Now, economic, that probably speaks for itself. The economy has changed to serve a different population, not serve the local population. Kind of makes you think about imperialism in general, neocolonialism, biological, so preventing births within the target group. Physical, which was divided into racial discrimination and feeding, endangering health, and mass killing. Now, mass killing isn't even a category in its own. Of course, it's important. It's very important, but it's almost like we only know about that.
Yeah, I think
the subcategory of one of the things he's talking about.
This is a really important point to make, right? And some of us have been trying to make this point, and there are journalists out there who have been trying to make this point as well. The destruction of the health system is going to kill more people in Gaza than the bombing campaign. Like that, the turning off of the water, the turning off of the power, the destruction of huge percentages of housing. As we come into winters, the blocking of food aid. These are examples of physical
emergency housing as well. Yeah. As we'll see this is codified in the convention as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, he also considered religious suppression to be genocidal, and moral. This is quite an interesting one. He wrote, therefore, the occupant made an effort in Poland to impose upon the Poles pornographic publications and movies. The consumption of alcohol was encouraged, for while food prices have soared, the Germans have kept down the price of alcohol, and the peasants are compelled by the authorities to take spirits in pay for agricultural produce. The curfew law, enforced very strictly against Poles, is relaxed if they can show authorities a ticket to one of the gambling houses which the Germans have allowed to come into existence.
I have never heard that before.
No, no, you won't have. This is what he's talking about. This is a complex attack on various aspects of the personhood, a collective personhood of a genos. Notice also that he keeps using Poles. Is not as much as I have in my selection, but I mean, probably 50% of his examples either are only about Poles or mention them because they're the most complete thing for him to talk about. And people would think he would be talking about what's happening to the Jewish people as a Jewish person whose relatives were liable to fall foul of this genocide. But he's not. He's talking about something broader, and that is the very one end of the spectrum, with the people of Luxembourg at the other, those defined as racially close to the Germans. But he sees it as one thing with a massive scope. So it is very broad, and it's quite complex, and it is absolutely nothing like the received ideas of what genocide is. So at the same time, clearly there was something there. He was clearly onto something. If he came from a milieu in Europe where the sort of violence that you would think about in terms of genocide would come in the form of communal violence or state or oligarchic violence against a minority, the persecution of minority. So this is where he's coming from, and obviously his historical interests are broader than that, but even so, they're still kind of focused on that area, Europe and the Mediterranean. And I think it shows how fundamental the idea of genocide is, that he was actually describing something that works so well to describe settler, colonial, and imperialist practices.
Yeah, I was going to draw that line as well.
Yeah, because this is what he discovered later in his life, not necessarily to his own benefit, but So, and I think as well, to be fair though, the Germans were copying, inspired by British imperialism, and indeed inspired by genocide in North America as practiced by the US, because the original model for the pass laws was in fact came from California.
No way.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. No. If you want to read something truly disturbing, read An American Genocide. I think it's called, by, oh God, I'm thinking Benjamin Madley. No, I don't know if I got the name right, but there is a book about the genocide in California, and it is shocking, and not least because of how recent it was. If you've read Blood Tide by Cormac McCarthy, that's like someone whitewashing the whole affair. If I got the name of that book right.
Yikes.
So it was really quite bad in many respects.
I want to draw a quick line just while we've settled on kind of the post description of Lemkin's overview of genocide as being manifold, right? And some of the, particularly the cultural and I guess social aspects of that, and draw that into the present day with the way a certain growing cadre of what you call like neoconservative or what they're trying to call themselves traditional conservative right wingers, people like Douglas Murray, for example, and here close to home as well, people like David Seymour are referring to Western civilization, and often when talking about indigenous cultures, or the other, which for someone like Murray is Muslims, refer to all the great things that Western civilization brings to another culture. And oh, look, Maori wouldn't have got anywhere without the British, right? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they're banking on the fact that Maori are still here to try and make the claim that there wasn't a kind of that settler colonialism isn't a real thing, essentially, that there was never a genocidal kind of intent by the British. But in fact, they give the lie to that with their bragging about Western culture and the way it was made to replace quite forcefully the culture of other peoples that were being invaded and colonized by mostly the British, but also, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch.
So, I mean, one of the ironies, of course, is if you read The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, like it shows that a lot of the things they're claiming as these great Western ideas are things that were found by Westerners in other societies as they were conquering and committing genocide. And, these things had intellectual power and moral power, so they have prevailed in a discourse which is often not even allowed to the victims in the periphery. So you like this civilizing force is kind of going in the other direction while they're exporting massive barbarism and savagery.
Well, yeah, and then like people like Murray will call it cultural exchange, right? Just
I
just
mean,
monstrous.
yeah. And the other thing is that they have this assumed norm, this assumed idea that what they do is universal. It's not a construct in itself, and therefore you can have one rule for all, and that's not imposing anything on anyone. But if some people want to actually just run their own lives in their own way, that's a massive imposition on you because why are they getting that privilege? And we have this is so well documented in our history. There are so many people who have said it quite blatantly. If you look at the judge who sent the troops in to Urewera in the dog war, he said that they needed, and it wasn't for a real reason, it was to demonstrate that they weren't beyond the long arm of the law. That I think for me qualifies as a statement of genocidal intent. You are saying that you are going to impose on them people who arguably, whether what the question of sovereignty and all of that is another one. But anyway, we might return to that subject at the end.
So cycling back.
Yes, so going back to so after the war, Lemkin thought the answer to genocide was to create a legal prohibition against it. And he was met with a great deal of initial enthusiasm from pretty much all parties. I mean, because, genocide was associated with Germany. It had been mentioned at Nuremberg and so forth as it wasn't charged as a crime, but it was. But some people started to get cold feet pretty quickly.
I wonder why.
Yeah, well, exactly. The US, the USSR, and the UK. Maybe it's because they begin with U. I mean,
I think it's the clue here. Yeah.
Yeah, we need to find out. I mean, if only there was a Ukraine at the time, we could have asked. I don't know. Anyway, but he did get it over the line, and his memoir is quite fascinating about his portrayal of his life at this time and what he did, which is all very positive. I'm not sure it was all necessarily as positive as he portrayed it, but you know. But anyway, he later in a legal journal wrote about the changes that were excluded from the original draft. He wrote the following. The crime only includes only biological and physical genocide. Original drafts made reference to cultural genocide, i.e. acts aimed at destruction of libraries, museums, schools, and historical monuments and religious edifices, or suppression of language or printing media of a particular group. But the United States successfully urged exclusion of this form of genocide. The American delegation expressed the belief that the convention should prescribe only acts directed towards the physical destruction of the designated groups themselves, and that acts tending towards the destruction of their institutions should be dealt with in a subsequent treaty for the protection of minorities. In making direct and public incitement to commit genocide a crime, the convention is again more limited than the substance of previous drafts. The original Secretariat draft also made punishable all forms of public propaganda tending by their systematic and hateful character to provoke genocide or make it appear as a necessary, legitimate, or excusable act. That would have been a handy thing to have around at the moment because
I wonder if anyone from Radio New Zealand is listening to this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, would they understand it if they heard it? I mean, there is that protective stupidity thing, you know. You can get quite selectively deaf if your job is on the line. Anyway, so the final legal definition, the most important part of it reads, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Now, when you say as such, it means destroying it as that thing. So attacking an individual as such would be like attacking them for being a member of that collectivity. So A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Or E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, so causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group could, of course, be interpreted in light of the type of cultural destruction or cultural and social destructions that he's talking about. And indeed, our current understanding might also suggest that inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part could be read quite broadly as well.
Yeah.
So, after that, Lemkin, having succeeded more or less, I mean, he pretty much felt he'd succeeded. He went on to study historical genocide. He taught at Rutgers for a while, but he died in poverty in 1959. 6 people attended his funeral. That's how well liked he was at the time. He met all of these very famous people and had done a lot of, ridiculously energetic work to get this done. He was obsessed. But he also wasn't one to compromise and probably wasn't great at reading a room. He might not have helped his career a lot because he had a considerable amount of focus on the genocide of Indigenous Americans, which wouldn't necessarily go down that well in 1950s USA. And he made the observation that Indian reservations were a type of concentration camp. So if he's teaching that sort of thing at Rutgers, I'd see why he might have been very successful in that part of his career. He doesn't really mention that sort of thing in his memoir. So at the same time, even though it was more restricted than Lemkin would have liked, I think the convention was too broad for the real world to handle. If you think about the fact that this wording, it doesn't specify particular numbers of dead people or anything like that, or a particular intensity. It really just describes a terrible way of acting. And governments act in terrible ways all the time. And one of the terrible things they do is often genocide. So, as the US historian Bruce Cummings would later write, at the very time that the US ratified that convention, it was committing genocide in Korea. But there is this doublethink involved, or this, I wouldn't even go so far as to call it doublethink, really. It's like people just not really thinking, what does this word mean? So the very first appeal to the UN to take action against genocide was in 1951, when the US Civil Rights Congress presented a petition to the UN entitled "We Charge Genocide." It detailed police violence, lynchings, and forms of economic discrimination and so forth to demonstrate genocide against African Americans. And it was, I think, nearly 300 pages, and it was pretty well researched and solidly argued. But as was to be a pattern in the future, people did not indeed disagree with it by trying to argue in contrary to what was presented, but they just condemned it outright without bothering with that, because you know the answer already. You know what genocide means already. It's what the bad Nazis did.
Yeah.
You don't need to look into things that you know aren't genocidal. So Eleanor Roosevelt called it ridiculous. The NAACP called it a gross and subversive conspiracy. And then Lemkin himself argued against it on the grounds that the African American population was growing, and said,
"You fool, Lemkin."
Said the CRC was trying to distract from genocide in the Soviet Union. So,
Wow, that's a really familiar one, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's a real big bait and switch. Lemkin, you're truly a genius.
I don't know if you know this, but you can't have two genocides existing at the same time. They can't,
No.
If someone's committing a genocide over there, you can't be.
No, I actually do know this because of the present day discourse, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I went to pitch a master's about the Iraq genocide to a genocide scholar or historian lecturing who considered themselves to be a specialist in genocide. And I said, I want to do this about the Iraq genocide. And the response was, you know that Saddam Hussein committed a genocide against the Kurds? And I'm like, of course I don't know. It takes me by surprise so much that someone would say that. I think that it's somehow, of course they would expect that it was news to me, for a start, was quite shocking. And that for them, that somehow related to what I was talking about, the US genocide in Iraq, which had been, this was, I don't know, 2009, something like that. So not really, this wasn't news. It had actually been written about by people with authority to write about it.
Yeah.
And so it just goes to show what standards we're dealing with sometimes. Anyway, basically, the word didn't really mean anything for a long time, apart from people with people just using it to mean extermination, and it didn't really come back into currency until the 1990s, which led to a little bit later there was a bit of a revival of Lemkin and his neglected legacy. As I said, though, I think the concept was maybe like it was, he grasped something fundamental in coming up with this, but I think it did exceed his expectations. And I think, unfortunately, his focus, he never really got rid of that prosecutor, and his focus kind of worked against a broader understanding. Even what I understand of his history of genocide, just looking at his lists of genocides and so forth, like you get the idea that he wasn't really expanding on the underlying thinking. He was listing stuff. It's a pity. He's like potentially, someone who maybe could have lent into being a theorist, but instead was lost to law and history. But yeah,
like so many.
Yes, yes. Or maybe Antonin Scalia could have, if he'd just gone a different way.
That's a name I
Anyway,
haven't heard for a while.
no, no, yeah. Yes, just thinking about another bad experience walking into an academic's office and seeing a shrine not long after Antonin Scalia died, and seeing a shrine to Antonin Scalia there. It was, yeah. Oh, well. It was very weird. And when I asked about it, they changed the topic very quickly.
At least they knew. At least they knew.
Anyway, so the logic of genocide does not in any sense mean that it's the greatest crime ever. I think this idea of the crime of crimes is part of the deliberate or the willful, twisting of the term. The people twisting the term don't necessarily understand what they're doing, so deliberate is the wrong word, but it is willful. Like the horrors of the Middle Passage weren't genocidal because the victims weren't from a particular genos. It wasn't aimed at their collectivity, but that doesn't mean it was less bad than the Armenian genocide. And the Srebrenica massacre wasn't, you can't say that was worse than the politicide in Indonesia, which people may know from the film The Act of Killing, in which 500,000 to 1 million people were killed in one of the most horrible crimes against humanity in the 20th century, which is saying something really. Anyway, what is true about genocide is that it can't ever be morally justified, because the nature of genocide means that you are inflicting harm on people for their identity, not for anything they've done.
Although they try and, this is one of those things that they try and obfuscate, right? And like this is a key part of propaganda that is meant to promote genocide, is to make the claim that a people are being killed for a thing that has been done.
Absolutely. And if you were going to commit a genocide, you wouldn't do it any other way. So the fact that a claim is made is no defense. It's like, merely having something you can claim is not doesn't prove anything. So I think this is why it's such an inconvenient term for the powers that be, because once you grasp the meaning of it, you see the patterns, and therefore you can immediately go, this is wrong. It doesn't matter what you say it's for, it's actually the wrong way of doing what you want to do, and we don't agree with it. So, for example, if I argued, and often it is true, that economic sanctions imposed by the US or the West in general are genocidal, then the legitimate response is to argue that they are not genocidal by going through the aspects and saying that, it's not genocidal because of this. Whereas to argue that it's not genocide because of the word doesn't apply is a bit ridiculous, especially because you're not actually saying that this is a morally justifiable thing. You're actually using the opportunity to focus on a word. And of course, the problem with you can't just not use the word, because the word is such a useful shorthand for what is happening. It encapsulates what's happening. So it's the way of cutting through that burden that people often have of arguing against power, in that they have to use 20 times as many words in order to establish something that is unorthodox. And so genocide is potentially a very powerful word for that. So so that is one of the dangers, I think, to power, is that genocidal practices would be abolished, including things like imposing sanctions on whole populations, which they have openly in the past. And they don't do so now so much, because I think this knowledge is starting to spread. But they used to say, we want the people to feel the pain so that they will overthrow their regime.
Yes, that's I still hear it. I still hear people say it. Like, it's,
Oh yeah,
especially in regards to US sanctions, eh?
absolutely. And that's genocidal intent. You are intending to cause physical harm to those people.
Yeah, I mean, they use it against when they're talking about Iran and when they're talking about Russia currently.
Yep, absolutely, yep. Yeah, I mean, they are a little bit more cautious. They're more cagey about it now, so that they can say these are targeted rather than. But yes, they do use that. They do admit to that logic still. So yeah, and people lean a lot on this idea of intent that you were mentioning before to police the term. So in the 90s, they invented the idea of a dolus specialis, a specific intent, as part of the jurisprudence that came out of places like the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia. So the way they describe intent, this specific intent or special intent sometimes, is not the way intent is described in other crimes. And their justification for that is that it is a crime made up of different acts. So now they remember it's composite and manifold, but those acts aren't themselves what's being prosecuted. So it's a little bit insane in a way. And
A little bit intentional, I think, perhaps.
Yes, perhaps. Yes, obfuscating with special intent, or specific intent. But Spain's ICJ case and Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, which, if people haven't heard of that particular phenomenon, which is an ongoing process, they should look it up and find out what's happening, because it is shocking.
It's horrific.
But anyway, they both argued that intent is established by the very nature of having multiple acts that work together in conjunction to harm a distinct protected group. Like, you can't, I mean, otherwise these things wouldn't be so well targeted, The very fact that it's focused on certain people is
As evidence of intent,
so
right? Or it should be.
Yeah. Now, both of those notably are talking about the state's culpability, and there is a problem. Like, when this whole focus on the crime and the prosecution, such as you might get through the International Criminal Court, means that you then create this idea that you have to have an individual with a mens rea, guilty mind, with that specific intent, because all of these different acts and blah, blah, blah. So, this is a kind of weird thing to come out of this, project of like demonstrating we can do justice to the bad people from Rwanda and Yugoslavia by saying you're bad, you're naughty. Now, genocide, of course, isn't committed by a person. There isn't a single genocide that has ever happened that really has less than thousands of perpetrators who have some level of culpability. It's the nature of genocide that it is very much a collective action. So, what I mean, I think that a lot of the acts within genocide are crimes anyway. So, it seems a strange focus to want to get someone who you could prosecute for other crimes and say, I want to prosecute them for genocide. So, I mean, that's not to say it shouldn't be a crime, but it does seem to take away from the ability to see it for what it is. So if you look at what's been happening in Gaza, the focus on intent
Such as it
leads to
is.
apologism, yeah, on the basis that Israel is claiming to have a non-genocidal military purpose. Well, as we've just said, like, of course they'd claim that. I mean, who wouldn't? But we don't normally just say if you can come up with some other explanation for why you've stolen this car, you haven't really stolen it.
Downloaded, thank you.
Sorry?
Downloaded this car?
I downloaded this car, yes. Yes. Yeah, so, and even like military expedients don't actually excuse genocidal acts. If you have a military purpose, but it is achieved by, prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention, that doesn't mean you don't have intent. Intent is not motive, you know? They are two different things. You're using genocide for a military purpose, but the way people talk, they conflate intent and motive a lot, and especially like it fits in with their portrayal of genocide as being something carried out by the demonic other, the bad dictator from who doesn't speak our sort of language and may not have our sort of skin color and doesn't believe in our Western values of only bombing people for democracy.
And in this case as well, like that doesn't even matter. Like people propagandists have tried to claim that matters. Like there is a difference between intent and motive, or trying to conflate the two. But there's enough like open intent from within Israel
Yeah,
that's irrelevant at this point. Like, and it has been since I think day one.
oh, absolutely. Although, I mean, my argument has always been not to lean too hard on that read because it could disappear. Because it is very difficult to say who can demonstrate intent for. I mean, yeah, sure. If you're going to, you're going to prosecute one particular person and say Yoav Gallant, and you go, you said this. That's fine. But we're not talking about that.
Yeah,
we are
we're talking about
trying to establish that a genocide is occurring. And, like, just because Yoav Gallant says something, you can't necessarily draw a line between that and the policies that are actually enacted and say, well, it's because he said that. Well, I mean, you probably can actually, but it does make a potential weakness in the argument to have to draw that line.
Yeah,
when
and like
is clearly there from the actual complexity of these actions.
and then if the ICC just snaps up him and Netanyahu, then there's this risk that they're like, oh, everything's okay now, right? Like, oh, we got the bad guys, it's all fine now, which is not the case because, as you say, every genocide in history has been prosecuted by thousands.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way they twist things is really quite a Western chauvinist and racist project. The convention is reasonably easy to read, and yet people will argue that black is white all the time, and they will lean into, of course, the existing information networks, which would incline people to believe some things and not others. So it's very easy to establish genocidal intent in the reported or purported nasty words of an African dictator, for example, whereas all of the many genocidal things said by US officials, politicians, generals, admirals, and so forth throughout history mean nothing. They absolutely mean nothing because they aren't who we are, That's not who we are.
Yeah, we're the good
So,
guys. We're the good guys,
yeah, we're the
Kieran.
good guys, so we can't commit genocide. And if someone says they want to, says something that's obviously genocidal and they are in charge, that's just, a slip of the tongue. So, the creating this crime of crime narrative helps that because it creates this exaggerated notion of this ultra bad thing, and they also uh, try to associate it more with attacks against internal minorities rather than attacks happening during warfare or attacks, on other countries or against insurgent populations in imperial or colonial settings. Despite the fact that historically, warfare has been very much associated with genocide in most instances. And Lemkin even wrote about it. He wrote, this is from Axis Rule, he wrote, for the German occupying authorities, war thus appears to offer the most appropriate occasion for carrying out their policy of genocide.
And this is the same as in Gaza right now, right?
Yeah.
And not in the West Bank, interestingly, where
Mm.
similar policies are being now implemented at a greater rate without any longer needing that kind of that theater about this being a war against Hamas.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's very worrying actually that that is going to create a momentum that will lead to. I mean, it's bad enough as it is, but could lead to something even worse. So, and I should add as well, Hitler himself said that the partisan warfare in Eastern Europe actually served their purposes in giving them a cover for sending in the Einsatzgruppen and so forth.
But we can't talk about that too much because otherwise centrists will say we're not allowed to fight back because otherwise the modern day Hitler will use it as an excuse to genocide us. So just,
Oh,
just...
yeah, okay. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is. But yeah, I think that it is worth reflecting on though. And that
Oh,
that
absolutely.
sometimes resistance can be a gift to the oppressor.
Well, I mean, it's a propaganda gift, right? It's a
Yeah,
it's a narrative gift that they're able to use. But if we're aware that they're going to do that,
yeah,
those of us that are not trying to excuse horrific crimes can say, okay, no, what's actually happening here is that they are misrepresenting this. They're still doing genocide.
uh, as a corollary to their idea that genocide is the crime of crimes and it's committed by slavering beasts who hate people just by looking at them. They just can't stand the sight of them, so they want to wipe them out. What they also cover up any sort of discourse about the kind of strategic and cold-blooded calculation that is often part of genocide, which you won't find in the mainstream discourse at all. And I think that which is it's a mainstream and also a scholarly discourse. I think it actually embodies a kind of genocidal racism in itself, in that it is totally erasing the experiences of people outside of the West, saying that they don't really count, and that if the West comes along and unalives them by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions, it's because they have made a tragic error while they've been out trying to do good in the world.
Yeah, I mean, this has got like this. I often piss people off by saying this, but by nature of being a Western chauvinist, people are baseline genocidal. Like, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah,
That's
yeah,
it's just it's sorry if you're gonna do that. Like this is one of the things that you're accepting.
yeah, totally. I mean, well, this is what it's about. It is about the dehumanization to the level where you think that it's all right to kill certain people in certain circumstances because they don't really count as much to you, and because war happens anyway, people die anyway. There are no doubt many people who feel that this is true of the people dying in Gaza. I think this is the key point about our misleadership class. Those fucking apologists, whatever you want to say. It's really difficult to come up with language strong enough to describe what absolute fuckknuckles they are. What they are probably telling themselves is, this sort of shit happens narrative without any ability to understand that they would never say that if it was a different lot of people, or any ability to even understand their hypocrisy over Ukraine, for example.
Oh, I
Anyway,
think also I would say like some of them do understand that,
some do. Some
like
don't care.
members of the ACT Party know what they're trying to do to Maori in this country, right? Like, and yeah, they're absolutely aware.
Yeah, yeah. So I think, you have to ask the question in these circumstances whether it's even useful to have genocide as a crime. As I've said in the past, when Spain presented its case, it was like, for me, like I suddenly had a vision of a world where genocide actually was a crime and it actually meant something for it to be a crime. I could see that that's possible. So maybe, but we're definitely not there. It is so the mechanisms for prosecuting genocide have really just totally ignoring what's genocide. So, and I do think it is better to understand it as theory and to see what it tells us about recurrent practices that we should be trying to abolish. So one of the things that I think helps us understand, I want to go a bit deeper than what I've described from Lemkin's personal history here. One of the things that I think is actually quite crucial was the inclusion in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of that the final act that it forbids forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So again, like this kind of this obviously contradicts the idea that people have some racial or genetic animus, necessarily, for it has to come out of that. Like hate the Jews, I think their blood has to be wiped out from the earth, sort of thing. That's clearly not going to happen if you take their children and have them raised by other people. But it kind of, at the same time, the fact that they are incorporating that shows a tacit admission that this is a slow generational process. It is aimed at changing something over quite a significant amount of time. It's not an overnight thing necessarily. So the idea of taking children from their own culture, you can look at it quite simply in the terms that they used for the residential school system in North America and Canada and the US, when they would say, kill the Indian and save the man, which I think is another perfect expression of genocidal intent, But they thought they were being kind, So that, of course, speaks directly to the idea that Lemkin mentioned of imposing the national pattern on a population once they remain. But, of course, the people thus having a national pattern imposed on them don't actually suddenly end up as part of this privileged, civilized society. We know that from experience here in Aotearoa, where Maori were told, often by people who believed it to be true, stop being Maori, start being European, and you'll be one of us, But of course, that's not the way it works in practice. What it does is create an underclass of people who have been essentially deracinated. So, and what this does is destroy the power of this group to exercise their autonomy and they're to exercise anything in resistance to the state, or indeed to the hegemonic ethnic group for that matter. So for Indigenous people, a lot of this is about connections to the land and the ability to derive resources and subsistence and commodities, for that matter, from the natural environment. There's a superior knowledge there that comes through generations that is very useful and very inconvenient for conquerors. If you look at the reason that African slaves were exported to the Americas, part of it is because they couldn't really enslave Indigenous people. Yeah, so the reason that African people were exported as slaves was Indigenous people in the Americas made terrible slaves because they can run away and survive on land very easily. You don't have that control over someone. So an Indigenous person has immediately more power to resist. Whereas if you uproot someone and put them in a place that's alien to them, you immediately have this control over them. And of course, taking someone from their family is a very complete way of severing them from this whole thing, this educational and cultural thing that gives them identity, it gives them psychological health and resources and belonging and so forth. And you're taking them away from that.
And this is something that has been, referred to by Te Pāti Māori as being genocidal, and then routinely attacked as ridiculous by, predominantly Pākehā and westernized media.
Yeah, and the westernized media presumably not interested in seeking any expert ideas on it, just want that sort of thing. Anyway, so I think as well, though, I think targeting the family actually reveals something else about genocide, in that it has a utopian nature. So utopianism, of course, but some people use it probably to mean something nice, trying to build a utopia. But utopian thinking is often means something rather nasty, in that it is a totalizing, controlling, megalomaniac vision for a completely structured world that is an expression of the person's ego being splattered out there all over everyone else. And utopians have often wanted to abolish families because family relations are a rival power to their schemes. And I think this is exactly the problem with families from the perspective of those who would commit genocide as well. So families are a key aspect of social networks, and not only the families you grow up with, but also the familial bonds you create along the way, which probably, I think in the West, they're very profound, but in other societies, they're even more profound. So, and when you develop freedom of movement within a polity, then you start to get into marriage and so forth, especially once you build a secular sort of society with basically along modern lines. And what we've seen is that this forms a kind of national genos that kind of begins to cohere and is not useful to an imperial power, neo-colonial power. It creates a rival. So if you've got a country that was, say, just a bunch of lines drawn on a map, then after a couple of generations, that's not necessarily the case. And if you look at, say, Iraq, which actually had a very long history with all of the current contemporary people there have had relations with each other for a long time. So they have this strong sense of identity anyway. But as a secular modern country, the intermarriage and so forth, even though obviously there's sectarian divides and there's remnant clan stuff, it still creates a sense of one country, which the US didn't like. And, partly what they did about that was chop off Kurdistan at the top. But also then, also they basically inflicted a decade and a half of genocidal sanctions and occupation, and then fomented a civil war, and then the West's pet enemy, the Islamic State, goes and kind of takes a big chunk out of the whole place. And it's just, this is the sort of thing that sets a population back by generations of development and strength. And that is the problem. That's what the problem is for the US. This is a country that has a Carter doctrine that says that, the flow of oil coming out of the Persian Gulf is their interest.
Yeah.
They don't use it themselves, but they want to control it. So that's why Iraq was a problem for them. And if you look at Yugoslavia, you have a very similar situation. You had these disparate groups that started to intermarry, and they really cohered. They had a strong sense of Yugoslav national identity and pride that really the kind of communal hatred that would arise between different ethnic groups actually came about quite a bit after the beginnings of the Civil War between those different groups. So, and indeed after the beginning of the genocide, because the Balkanization created space for ethnocratic leaders whose interests are advanced by creating enmity with the other ethnic groups. Thus, I think you could say that the logic of genocide is innate to imperialism.
Yeah, this is that Western chauvinism stuff kind of writ large, right?
Oh, absolutely. All Western chauvinism is tool of this in some ways, though, rather than it's not the motive. The empire, to be an empire, it has to dominate other people and force them to work against their own interests, to do things that aren't for them. And then I think where the Western chauvinism comes in is that you can then tell yourself that these people are better off with you running their lives rather than them having the independence to run their own. So and a really very similar thing with the way the states deals with minorities, being more interventionist in their lives, to their great detriment, but saying it's for their welfare, which is, at best you'd call it paternalistic, but it's basically racist. So, if you think of the racial disparities in mass incarceration, I would call them genocidal. And when I say genocide, of course, what I'm saying is the shorthand for saying that people are affected for their identity, right? Not because, and this is stochastic genocide because they're being picked up by a system bit by bit, but the prejudice is against them in that, and it is real harm, and it's real harm that affects their entire collectivity.
And you can talk about life expectancy as well, right? In the same way, or you can talk about life expectancy or health outcomes.
Oh, disparities in health. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can talk about socioeconomic position in the same way, of course. But these things are never separate because genocide is, of course, composite and manifold. So, this obviously can be applied to Maori, and I think that because we are so close to that particular issue, it's interesting. It's interesting to think of this instance if we want to think about how genocide can be ended and when you could say that a genocide is no longer happening, right? And I think it would be very hard to pick an end point for genocide and say, well, that's it, it's over. But I do think that we can see it's much easier and probably more important to see how you end genocide. And that is to give power to the victim group. So you give them the power for self-determination, for autonomy. And what have Maori been asking for? Tino raratiratanga, manumota hake. These are terms used for people who obviously know what they need to try and establish what they need. And we look at the health reforms that were aimed at sort of establishing that had been rolled back we see the way like this universal idea of one rule fits all type things.
Yeah, I mean,
being used.
we use that word right at the top, right? But immediately you start thinking of, that's exactly the term that David Seymour and the ACT Party are using, that his
Yeah,
mates
yeah.
in different AstroTurf groups are using, right? This is
Yes, totally.
and one rule for all is, and the way they're using it, inherently genocidal as well.
Oh yeah, totally, totally, yes. So I mean, and to end that, we have to like embrace something quite different, So I mean, obviously, I mean, the main thing is to end all genocidal, all imperialist violence, all imperialism, because you can't run an empire without genocide. So we shouldn't tolerate it, and we shouldn't say that it's all right because we're better, or that, or the Americans are better, or whatever. The West is better, NATO is better. It's just unacceptable. And on the nation state level, I think there has to be some like level to which there is a confederalist sort of situation where certain minorities, like Indigenous people or religious and sectarian minorities, can have autonomy within a broader democratic state, which and not to the expense at the expense of any individuals. So I'm not talking about like say a certain Middle Eastern state that allows religions to run their civil law and then calls itself the only democracy in the Middle East. No, not to persecute individuals. So individual rights to be respected, but like the real version of what David Seymour claims to believe in. Yeah, but yeah. So I think yeah, that's my recipe for ending genocide. So that's all done.
Oh, done. Finally
right.
got it out there in the world.
Yeah,
Hey,
you just get it out there, or it'll be over very soon.
Get everyone to listen to this podcast. We've got it. We're solving here on 1 of 200 once again. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Kieran. It's been great to have you on.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
And I'm sure we'll have you back, as we have many times before, as for the foreseeable future, imperialism and genocides continue. Good to have you here to help unpack that for our audience and to give your thoughts about it. If you've enjoyed this, like, share, subscribe, etc. We are always trying to bring you something from an Aotearoa perspective that you're not getting in mainstream news and from legacy media. So get on board, subscribe, and keep up to date. Thank you again, Kieran. We'll catch you next time.
If artifice is art, then I'm living a pointless life, but I'm learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The words upon now is paid with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day. This vindictive, forgetful fucking race.